Hi, I'm Natalie. When I was 17, my parents threw me out the night after graduation because I refused to give up my college acceptance. My mother said I was selfish. My father called me ungrateful. 6 years later, I walked into their landlord's office, sat in the chair across from him, and introduced myself as his new boss. Then I did something they never saw coming. I raised their rent by 40%. But that increase wasn't about the money. It was about reclaiming every night I slept in my car, every meal I skipped, every time they told me I'd amount to nothing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Ever been thrown away by the people who were supposed to protect you, only to come back holding all the cards? Stay with me, because what happened when they realized who signed their new lease made my father go silent for the first time in his life. The rain came down in sheets that June evening in Portland, the kind that turns the streets into mirrors and makes everything look softer than it actually is. I remember standing on the front porch of the house I grew up in, a small 2-bedroom rental in Beaverton with peeling paint on the window frames and a front yard my father never quite got around to fixing. My graduation gown was still in my hand, the cheap polyester already damp from the walk back from the school gym where I just received my diploma. Inside, I could hear them arguing about me before I even opened the door. My mother's voice carried that sharp edge it always had when she'd made up her mind about something. My father's was lower, resigned, like he'd already given up whatever fight he might have put up on my behalf. My older brother Kyle was probably in his room with headphones on, the way he always was when things got tense. He'd learned long ago that staying invisible was safer than picking sides. I pushed the door open and stepped into the narrow hallway that smelled like microwave dinners and old carpet. The living room was small, crowded with furniture that didn't quite fit, a couch with a permanent sag in the middle, a coffee table covered in mail and empty soda cans. My mother stood by the kitchen counter, arms crossed, lips pressed into that thin line I'd come to recognize as the prelude to something terrible. My father sat in his recliner, not looking at me, just staring at the television even though it wasn't on. I set my graduation cap on the small table by the door, next to the stack of bills that always seemed to be there. For a second, nobody spoke. The silence stretched out like a held breath, and I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. Then my mother broke it. "You got that letter, didn't you? The one from the university." I nodded slowly. I'd been accepted to Portland State with a partial scholarship. It wasn't a full ride, but it was something. It was a chance. I'd been working part-time at a coffee shop downtown since sophomore year, saving every dollar I could. I had a plan. Community college first to save money, then transfer. Maybe finish in 5 years instead of 4. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. "Mom," I said, keeping my voice steady, "I can make this work. I've already looked into student loans and I can pick up more shifts at the cafe. I won't ask you for anything. I just need to stay here while I go to school. Just for a little while." My mother laughed, but there was no warmth in it. It was the kind of laugh that cuts. "Your father and I have been talking. We've given you 18 years of our lives, Natalie. 18 years of food, of a roof over your head, of everything. And this is how you repay us? By making selfish decisions that are going to bury you in debt? It's not selfish to want an education." She stepped closer, and I could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the lines around her mouth that hadn't been there a few years ago. It is when you're chasing a dream that's not realistic. You're a decent student, sure, but college? That's for kids whose parents can afford it. That's not us. You need to get a real job, contribute to this household, help your brother when he needs it. That's what family does. I felt something crack inside me, a small fracture that I'd been trying to hold together for years. I've been working since I was 15. I've helped. I've paid for my own clothes, my own phone, my own everything. I'm not asking you to pay for college. I'm asking you to let me live here while I figure it out. My father finally spoke, his voice flat and tired. "You think you're smarter than us, don't you? You think because you got some piece of paper today that you're better than the people who raised you. That's not what I think at all. He stood up then, and I saw how much older he looked. His shoulders slumped, his face drawn. We didn't go to college, Natalie. Your mother and I worked with our hands our whole lives, and we did just fine. We put food on the table. We kept a roof over your head. But you've always had this attitude like you deserve more. Like what we gave you wasn't enough. I felt tears burning behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not yet. Not in front of them. I never said it wasn't enough. I just want more for myself. Is that really so wrong? My mother shook her head slowly. You want to be an adult? You want to make your own decisions? Then you do it on your own. We're done. You have until tonight to pack your things and leave. The words hit me like cold water. I stared at her, waiting for her to take it back, to say she didn't mean it. But her face was stone. My father just turned away, sinking back into his chair like the conversation had already drained whatever energy he had left. Kyle's door stayed closed. I stood there for a moment longer, my mind racing through possibilities. Maybe if I apologized. Maybe if I promised to get a full-time job and forget about school. Maybe if I made myself smaller, quieter, less ambitious, they'd let me stay. But then I realized something that settled into my chest like a weight I'd been carrying without knowing it. If I gave up now, if I bent to make them comfortable, I'd spend the rest of my life doing it. I'd become someone I didn't recognize. Someone who traded dreams for approval. So I walked down the hallway to the room I'd shared with Kyle when we were younger, the one that became mine when he moved to the bigger bedroom. It wasn't much. A twin bed with a quilt my grandmother made before she passed, a small desk I'd found at a thrift store, a bookshelf crammed with novels and textbooks I'd collected over the years. On the wall, I'd pinned a postcard of the Portland Japanese garden, a place I used to walk to when I needed to think. I'd always loved how peaceful it was there, how the world felt manageable inside those gates. I pulled my old duffel bag from the closet and started packing. Clothes first. Then my journal, a brown leather notebook I'd been writing in since I was 14. It was filled with lists and plans and sketches of the life I wanted to build. My college acceptance letter was tucked inside the front pocket. I packed my laptop, the one I'd bought used with my savings. My charger. A few books I couldn't leave behind. A photo of my grandmother holding me when I was a baby. She was the only one who ever told me I could be anything I wanted. It didn't take long. Everything I owned that mattered fit into one bag. I left behind the stuffed animals from childhood, the participation trophies from middle school sports I never cared about, the framed picture of our family from a trip to the coast when I was 12 and still believed we were happy. When I came back out, my mother was waiting by the door. She didn't say anything. She just opened it and stood there, holding it like a boundary I wasn't allowed to cross back over. My father was still in his chair. Kyle's door was still closed. I walked past her without a word. The rain had lightened to a drizzle, and the air smelled like wet asphalt and cut grass. I stood on the porch for a second, looking back at the house one more time. The porch light flickered the way it always did. The mailbox hung crooked on its post. It looked smaller now, like it had already started shrinking into memory. I walked to my car, an old Honda Civic I'd bought for $800 from a teacher at school who felt sorry for me. It had a dent in the passenger door and the air conditioning didn't work, but it ran. I threw my duffel bag into the back seat and sat behind the wheel, hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I didn't cry. Not yet. I just sat there as the rain picked up again, drumming softly on the roof, and I thought about what came next. I had $300 in my checking account. I had a car. I had a job that paid $9 an hour. I had nowhere to go. But I also had something they didn't expect. I had a plan. I'd been writing it in my journal for 2 years, mapping out every possible step. Work full-time. Enroll in community college part-time. Save every dollar. Build something they said I couldn't. And one day, maybe years from now, prove to them and to myself that I was worth more than their low expectations. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts. There was one person I could call. Dr. Ramona Wells, my English teacher from junior year. She'd written my college recommendation letter. She'd told me once that if I ever needed anything, I could reach out. It was late, almost 9, but I called anyway. She picked up on the third ring. Natalie? Her voice was kind, a little surprised. Is everything okay? I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. Not really. My parents just kicked me out. I don't have anywhere to go tonight. There was a pause, then a sigh that sounded more sad than shocked. Stay where you are. I'll come get you. We'll figure this out. 20 minutes later, she pulled up in her silver Subaru, rain streaking down the windshield. She got out and walked over to my car, tapping on the window. I rolled it down. You can stay with me tonight, she said. Tomorrow we'll make a plan. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But right now, you need to get out of this rain and get some rest. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I followed her back to her house in southeast Portland, a small cottage with a garden in the front and warm lights glowing through the windows. She made me tea and set up the guest room with fresh sheets and a towel. She didn't ask me a lot of questions. She just let me sit at her kitchen table, holding a mug I didn't drink from, and breathe. That night, lying in a bed that wasn't mine, in a house that smelled like books and lavender, I pulled out my journal and wrote one sentence at the top of a blank page. They think this is the end. It's only the beginning. I didn't know how long it would take. I didn't know all the steps I'd have to climb or all the doors I'd have to knock on. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was going to survive this. And one day, I was going to stand in front of them again, not as the daughter they threw away, but as someone they couldn't ignore. Someone who built a life so solid, so undeniable, that their rejection would echo back to them louder than anything they ever said to me. I closed the journal and turned off the light. Outside, the rain finally stopped. And in the quiet that followed, I let myself feel it. Not the sadness. Not the anger. Just the decision. The choice to keep going. Because that's what they didn't understand. You can't break someone who refuses to stay broken. Dr. Wells let me stay for 3 days. On the morning of the 4th, she sat me down at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a notebook, the kind professors use with the black and white speckled cover. She slid it across to me along with a pen. Write down every skill you have, she said. Every single thing you're good at, no matter how small it seems. I looked at the blank page, feeling the weight of the question. I'm good at making coffee, I said, half joking. She didn't smile. Write it down. So I did. Barista skills. Customer service. Then I kept going. Fast learner. Organized. Good with numbers. Reliable. Can work long hours without complaining. By the time I finished, I'd filled half a page. Dr. Wells leaned over and read through the list, nodding slowly. You're not helpless, Natalie. You're resourceful. Now we just need to turn these into opportunities. She made calls that afternoon while I sat on her couch, pretending to read but really just listening. She knew people, former students who'd gone into business, colleagues who ran nonprofits, friends who owned properties around the city. By evening, she had 3 leads for me. A room for rent in a shared house in the Hawthorne district, $400 a month including utilities. A second job possibility at a bookstore near campus. And the name of someone at Portland Community College who could help me navigate financial aid. Within a week, I'd moved into the shared house, a creaky old Portland craftsman with 5 other tenants, most of them students or artists trying to make rent while chasing their own versions of success. My room was barely big enough for a bed and a desk, but it had a window that looked out onto a maple tree, and when the light came through in the mornings, it felt like hope. I kept my job at the coffee shop and picked up the bookstore position 3 evenings a week. Between the two, I was pulling 50-hour weeks, but the routine kept me focused. Wake up at 5. Open the cafe at 6. Work until 2. Grab something to eat. Get to the bookstore by 3. Close at 9. Go home. Sleep. Repeat. On my days off, I enrolled at Portland Community College. 2 classes to start. Business fundamentals and accounting. I told myself if I could just get through the basics, I could build towards something bigger. Dr. Wells had planted an idea in my head during one of our last conversations at her house. Real estate, she'd said. It's one of the few industries where you can start with almost nothing and build wealth if you're smart and patient. People always need places to live. I didn't know anything about real estate except that my parents rented and complained about their landlord constantly. Mr. Harlow owned half the properties in Beaverton, including the house I grew up in. He was old, traditional, the kind of man who still collected rent checks in person and kept records in filing cabinets instead of computers. My parents hated him because he raised their rent every year and never fixed anything unless they called 3 times. But I started paying attention. I read books from the library about property investment. I listened to podcasts while walking between jobs. I learned about leverage, equity, cash flow, tenant laws. I started seeing the city differently, not just as streets and buildings, but as assets, opportunities, potential. One afternoon, about 8 months after I'd moved out, I was shelving books in the real estate section when a man came in looking for a specific title. He was older, maybe mid-50s, with silver hair and the kind of calm confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are. He asked if we had anything on property management systems, and I pointed him to a row near the back. You work in property management? I asked, trying not to sound too eager. He smiled. Own a small firm, actually. Been doing it for 20 years. Why, you interested in the field? I am, I said. I'm studying business right now, but I want to get into real estate eventually. He handed me his card. Tommy Nguyen. If you're serious, send me your resume. I'm always looking for people who are hungry to learn. I sent the email that night. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in his office in the Pearl District, a sleek space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. He offered me an entry-level position, part-time, doing administrative work and learning the systems. The pay was barely above minimum wage, but it came with something more valuable. Access. Knowledge. A foot in the door. I quit the bookstore and took the job. For the next 2 years, I worked at the cafe in the mornings and at Tommy's firm in the afternoons and evenings. I answered phones, filed paperwork, scheduled maintenance requests, learned how to read contracts and lease agreements. I watched how Tommy negotiated with tenants, how he handled difficult conversations, how he balanced compassion with business sense. He started giving me more responsibility. Small tasks at first. Collecting rent checks. Conducting property inspections. Then bigger things. Drafting lease renewals. Meeting with contractors. Sitting in on investor calls. I absorbed everything like I was studying for a test I couldn't afford to fail. During this time, I barely thought about my parents. I didn't call. They didn't call me. It was like we'd mutually agreed to pretend the other didn't exist. I heard things through the grapevine occasionally. Kyle had dropped out of community college and was working at a warehouse. My father's hours had been cut at the factory. My mother was still cleaning houses, her back getting worse every year. I felt a pang of something when I heard these things. Not quite sympathy, not quite satisfaction. Just distance. Like they were characters in a story I used to know. Then one night, almost 3 years after they'd kicked me out, I was going through property files at Tommy's office, updating tenant records, when I saw a familiar address. The house in Beaverton. My childhood home. It was part of a portfolio that Tommy's firm had just taken over. Harlow Properties had been sold to a larger investment group, and Tommy had been contracted to manage the transition. I stared at the address for a long time, my heart doing something complicated in my chest. My parents were now, technically, Tommy's tenants. Which meant they were partially my responsibility. I didn't tell him. Not yet. I just kept working. By my 4th year out of my parents' house, I'd saved nearly $30,000. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a foundation. I'd been living as cheaply as possible, sharing that tiny room in Hawthorne, eating ramen and day-old pastries from the cafe, never buying anything I didn't absolutely need. Every extra dollar went into a savings account I'd nicknamed the plan. Tommy noticed. He pulled me aside one afternoon and told me he was impressed with my work ethic, my attention to detail, the way I treated tenants with respect even when they were difficult. He said he wanted to bring me on full-time as an assistant property manager with a real salary and benefits. I accepted immediately. It meant I could finally quit the cafe, focus entirely on real estate, and start taking classes toward my bachelor's degree at Portland State. I was 21 years old, and for the first time since I'd been thrown out, I felt like I was building something that couldn't be taken away from me. That's when Tommy told me about his plan to retire. Not immediately, but within 5 years. He wanted to travel with his wife, spend time with his grandkids, step back from the grind. He was looking for someone to eventually take over the firm, someone he could trust. I'd like you to consider it, he said. You'd need to get licensed, build up more capital, prove you can handle the operational side. But I think you have what it takes. I went home that night and pulled out my journal, the same leather notebook I'd packed the night I left. I flipped back through the pages, reading the plans I'd written when I was 17 and desperate and angry. Most of them were naive, overly ambitious, the fantasies of someone who didn't understand how long real success takes. But underneath all of it was one consistent thread. I wanted to build something. I wanted to prove I could. Now, sitting in my small room with the maple tree outside the window, I realized I was closer than I'd ever imagined. Not there yet. Not even halfway. But closer. I wrote a new entry. 5-year plan. Get licensed as a property manager. Save enough for a down payment on my first property. Learn everything Tommy knows. Build credibility. Build wealth. Build a life where nobody can ever make me feel small again. And then, at the bottom of the page, I wrote something I hadn't allowed myself to think about in years. One day, I'm going to own the house they threw me out of. And they're going to pay me rent. It felt dangerous to write it down, like speaking it into existence might jinx it or reveal how petty and broken I still was underneath all the progress. But I didn't cross it out. I let it sit there on the page, a goal that was equal parts ambition and unfinished business. The next morning, I started studying for my property management license. I took the exam 6 months later and passed on the first try. Tommy threw a small celebration at the office, just the two of us and a bottle of champagne he'd been saving. He toasted to my future, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. Not the kind someone gives you. The kind you earn. Around that same time, I got a message on social media from someone I hadn't heard from in years. Kyle. My brother. The message was short, awkward, like he wasn't sure if I'd even respond. Hey. I know it's been a while. Just wanted to see if you're doing okay. Mom and Dad don't really talk about you. I wasn't sure if you were still in Portland. I stared at the message for a long time before replying. I'm good. Working in property management. Going to school. You? His response came a few hours later. I'm all right. Still at the warehouse. Living with Mom and Dad still. It's fine, I guess. They're the same. You know how it is. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just sent back a thumbs up emoji and left it alone. He didn't push. We didn't become close again. But something about that small exchange reminded me that they were still out there, still in that house, still living the same life they'd been living when they decided I didn't fit into it anymore. I went back to work. I kept saving. I kept learning. And slowly, step by step, year by year, I built the foundation for everything that would come next. I didn't know exactly when the moment would arrive. I just knew I'd be ready when it did. Because the thing about being thrown away is that it teaches you something valuable. It teaches you that the only person you can really count on is yourself. And once you learn that lesson, once you internalize it, you become dangerous. Not in a violent way. In a quiet, determined, unstoppable way. I became that kind of dangerous. The kind that doesn't make noise. The kind that just keeps moving forward, brick by brick, until one day you look up and realize you've built a fortress. And they're still standing outside in the rain. 2 years passed. I turned 23, then 24. I finished my associate degree and transferred to Portland State, taking night classes toward a bachelor's in business administration. Tommy officially brought me in as a partner in the firm, a junior stake, but real ownership. It meant profit sharing, decision-making power, a seat at the table. We expanded the portfolio, taking on more properties, hiring 2 additional staff members. I was managing nearly 200 units across the metro area, dealing with everything from burst pipes to lease violations to tenant disputes. I loved it. The problem solving, the negotiations, the tangible results. Every month, I could see the business growing, and I could see my own bank account growing with it. I bought my first property when I was 25. A small duplex in North Portland, a fixer-upper that needed work but had good bones. I used my savings for the down payment and a loan for the rest. I spent weekends repainting walls, refinishing floors, learning how to fix things I'd only ever hired contractors to handle. When it was ready, I rented out both units and suddenly I was a landlord. Not just a manager. An owner. The rental income covered the mortgage and then some. I reinvested the profit into repairs and upgrades, building equity, building value. It felt like planting a seed and watching it grow. Slow, steady, undeniable. That same year, Tommy told me he was ready to start stepping back. His wife had been diagnosed with a health condition that wasn't serious but required attention, and he wanted to spend more time with her while they could still travel and enjoy life. He offered to sell me majority ownership of the firm over a 5-year buyout plan, structured so I could afford it without drowning in debt. I said yes before he even finished explaining the terms. We shook hands in his office, the city lights glowing behind him, and I felt like I was standing on the edge of something huge. Not just success. Legacy. Within 6 months, the paperwork was done. I owned 51% of Ngwin Property Management. Tommy stayed on as a consultant, helping with the transition, but the day-to-day decisions were mine. The business was mine. The future was mine. I celebrated alone that night, sitting on the balcony of my new apartment, a 1-bedroom in the Pearl District with a view of the Willamette River. I'd moved out of the shared house in Hawthorne a year earlier, finally able to afford my own space. It wasn't luxury, but it was mine. Fully mine. I poured a glass of wine and opened my journal, flipping back through the years of entries. The desperate plans from when I was 17. The slow, grinding progress of my early 20s. The small victories that added up to something bigger. And then I turned to a blank page and wrote the date. Underneath it, I wrote one sentence. I'm ready. I didn't specify what I was ready for. I didn't need to. I already knew. The next week, I was reviewing the quarterly financials for the properties we managed when I came across the Beaverton portfolio again. Harlow Properties had fully transferred to the new ownership group, and we were now the primary managers. I pulled up the tenant records and saw my parents' names. Dennis and Patricia Cross. Lease renewal coming up in 60 days. Their rent hadn't increased in 3 years, grandfathered in under the old management's policies. The property itself was underperforming compared to market rates. If we brought it in line with comparable rentals in the area, we could raise the monthly payment by about 30%. Standard business practice. Completely legal. Entirely justifiable. I sat with that information for a long time, staring at the numbers on the screen. I could do it. I had the authority. I had the reason. But did I have the right? Then I thought about the night they kicked me out. The rain. The silence. My mother holding the door open like I was a stranger. My father in his chair, not even looking at me. The years of sleeping in my car, of skipping meals, of working myself to exhaustion just to prove I could survive. I opened a new email and began drafting the lease renewal notice. Professional. Courteous. Firm. The rent would increase by 40%, effective in 60 days. Standard increases to align with current market conditions. Options for payment plans if needed. Contact information for questions. I read it over 3 times, my hand hovering over the send button. Then I clicked it. The email went out automatically to all tenants receiving renewals that cycle, including my parents. I closed my laptop and walked to the window. The city stretched out below me, lights flickering on as evening settled in. Somewhere out in Beaverton, my parents were probably sitting in that same living room, in that same house, living that same small life. And tomorrow, they'd open their mail and see my name at the bottom of the letter. Not as their daughter. As their landlord's boss. As the person who now had power over the one thing they'd always worried about. Their home. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vengeful. I just felt quiet. Like something that had been unbalanced for years had finally shifted back into place. The withdrawal had begun. Not of money. Of silence. Of power. Of the future they said I'd never have. And this was only the beginning. The first call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing maintenance requests at my desk. The number wasn't saved in my phone, but I recognized the area code. Beaverton. I let it ring through to voicemail and went back to work, my pulse steady, my mind clear. The voicemail notification appeared a minute later. I didn't listen to it right away. I finished responding to a tenant complaint about a broken dishwasher, approved 2 repair invoices, and scheduled a walkthrough for a vacant unit in Northeast Portland. Then, with my coffee in hand, I pressed play. Natalie. It was my mother's voice, clipped and tight. This is your mother. I don't know if you're aware, but we received a notice about our rent increasing. There must be some mistake. The amount they're asking is unreasonable. We've been good tenants for over a decade. I need you to call me back and help us sort this out. This is ridiculous. The message ended. No greeting. No asking how I was. Just a demand disguised as a request for help. I deleted it and set my phone face down on the desk. An hour later, another call. This time from my father's number. I let that one go to voicemail too. His message was shorter, gruffer. Natalie, your mother says you work in property management now. We got a letter about our rent going up damn near half. We can't afford that. Call us back. I saved both messages but didn't respond. Not yet. I wanted to see how long it would take, how many times they'd reach out before they realized I wasn't going to make this easy for them. By the end of the week, there were 6 missed calls and 4 voicemails. The tone shifted with each one. First, confusion. Then irritation. Then something closer to panic. The last message was from my mother again, and her voice had lost its edge, replaced by something softer, almost pleading. Natalie, please. I know we haven't talked in a long time, and I know things ended badly between us. But this is serious. We don't have anywhere else to go. Just call me back. Please. I listened to that one twice, sitting alone in my apartment as the sun set over the river. The sky turned pink and orange, the kind of light that makes everything look gentler than it is. I thought about calling her back. I thought about what I'd say. But I wasn't ready. Not because I didn't have the words, but because I wanted them to sit with the uncertainty a little longer. I wanted them to feel what it's like when the people you depend on go silent. On Monday, I drafted a formal response. Professional, brief, emotionless. I sent it via email to the address on file for their lease. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Cross, Thank you for reaching out regarding your recent lease renewal notice. The rent adjustment reflected in your renewal is consistent with current market rates for comparable properties in your area. Our firm conducted a comprehensive review of rental values, and the new rate aligns with industry standards. If you have concerns about affordability, we're happy to discuss payment plan options or provide resources for rental assistance programs in your area. Please feel free to contact our office during business hours to schedule a consultation. Best regards, Natalie Cross, Director of Property Management, Ngwin Property Management. I read it 3 times before sending it. It was perfect. Polite enough to be unassailable. Cold enough to make a point. The reply came within an hour. It was from my mother, written in all caps like she was shouting through the screen. Natalie, this is your mother, not some random tenant. You can't seriously be doing this to us. We are your family. Call me. I didn't respond. I forwarded the email to Tommy with a note asking how he'd typically handle emotionally charged tenant communications. He replied with advice about maintaining professional boundaries and offered to take over the account if it was creating a conflict of interest for me. I thanked him but said I could handle it. That evening, Kyle called. I almost didn't pick up, but curiosity got the better of me. His voice sounded strained, uncomfortable. Hey, Nat. So, Mom's kind of losing it over here. She says you're the one raising the rent on them? I leaned back in my chair, looking out at the city lights. That's not exactly accurate. The company I work for manages the property. The rent increase is a standard market adjustment. He exhaled, a sound caught somewhere between frustration and disbelief. Come on. You know they can't afford this. Dad's hours got cut again last month. Mom's barely making anything cleaning houses. They're already behind on bills. Then maybe they should look into rental assistance. Or consider downsizing. There are cheaper options available. There was a long pause. This is messed up, Natalie. I know they weren't great to you, but this is cold. I felt a flicker of something sharp in my chest, but I kept my voice even. What's cold is kicking your daughter out at 17 and not speaking to her for 8 years. What's cold is telling her she'd never amount to anything and then acting surprised when she proves you wrong. Kyle was quiet for a moment. I didn't agree with what they did. You know that. But they're still our parents. And they're struggling. So was I said quietly. For a long time. Nobody called to check on me then. He didn't have an answer for that. The silence stretched out until he finally muttered that he had to go and hung up. I set the phone down and stared at it for a while, feeling the weight of the conversation settle around me like smoke. I wasn't trying to destroy them. I wasn't even trying to hurt them. I was just refusing to save them from the consequences of a business decision that had nothing to do with our history. If they wanted to see it as personal, that was their choice. But I wasn't going to apologize for doing my job. 2 weeks later, I received a formal request for a meeting. It came through the office, professionally written, asking to discuss lease terms and explore possible accommodations. The email was signed by both my parents, and it included an apology for any previous unprofessional communication. I scheduled the meeting for the following Friday at 11 in the morning. Our office, not theirs. My territory, not theirs. The days leading up to it felt strange. I prepared like I would for any tenant negotiation, reviewing their payment history, the property condition reports, comparable market data. But underneath the professional detachment, there was something else. Anticipation. Not excitement, exactly. More like the feeling you get standing at the edge of something high, knowing you're about to jump. Friday arrived with clear skies and a crispness in the air that felt like autumn even though it was still early September. I dressed carefully that morning. A charcoal blazer, tailored pants, low heels. Professional, authoritative, put together. I braided my hair and kept my makeup minimal. I wanted to look like someone who belonged exactly where she was. I arrived at the office early and made sure the conference room was ready. Water glasses on the table, a folder with all the relevant documents, my notebook open to a fresh page. I sat in the chair at the head of the table and waited. They arrived exactly on time. I heard the receptionist greet them at the front desk, her voice polite and warm. Then footsteps in the hallway. Then the door opened, and there they were. My mother looked older. Her hair had more gray than I remembered, pulled back in a loose bun. She wore a floral blouse and khaki pants, the kind of outfit she used to wear to church when I was a kid. My father stood behind her, his shoulders hunched slightly, his face lined and tired. He wore a flannel shirt and jeans, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. For a second, we all just stood there, the air thick with things unsaid. Then my mother cleared her throat and stepped forward. "Natalie. Thank you for seeing us." I gestured to the chairs across from me. "Please, sit down." They sat, stiff and awkward, like they weren't sure if they were allowed to be comfortable. My mother folded her hands on the table. My father stared at the water glass in front of him like it might offer some kind of escape. I kept my expression neutral, my voice calm. "I understand you wanted to discuss the lease renewal. I'm happy to go over the details and see if we can find a solution that works for everyone." My mother nodded quickly, too quickly. "Yes. We've been in that house for almost 15 years, Natalie. We've always paid on time, never caused any trouble. This increase, it's just not manageable for us right now." I flipped open the folder and pulled out a printed spreadsheet. "According to our records, your current rent is $850 a month. The new rate brings it to $1,190. That's about a 40% increase, which I understand feels significant. However, comparable homes in your neighborhood are currently renting for between $1,200 and $1,300. We're actually on the lower end of market value." My father finally spoke, his voice rough. "We don't care about market value. We care about being able to keep a roof over our heads." I looked at him directly for the first time. "I understand that. And there are options. You could apply for a county rental assistance program. You could negotiate a graduated increase over 6 months instead of all at once. Or you could look for a more affordable property. I'm happy to provide references for other listings in the area." My mother's face tightened, her eyes starting to shine with something that might have been tears. "You're really going to sit there and talk to us like we're strangers? Like you don't know us?" I met her gaze without flinching. "You made me a stranger 8 years ago." The room went silent. My father shifted in his chair, and my mother pressed her lips together, blinking rapidly. "We made mistakes," she said quietly. "I know that. But we were doing the best we could at the time. You were so determined to go to college, and we just didn't see how it was possible. We thought we were being realistic." "You thought you were protecting yourselves from watching me fail," I said. "You didn't want to deal with the embarrassment of having a daughter who tried and couldn't make it. So you cut me loose before I even had a chance." "That's not fair," my father muttered. "Maybe not," I said. "But it's how it felt." My mother reached across the table like she might try to take my hand, but stopped halfway, her fingers hovering in the empty space. "We're sorry, Natalie. Truly. We didn't know how else to handle it. And we didn't know you'd," she paused, searching for the right words, "that you'd end up doing so well." I nodded slowly. "You didn't know because you didn't ask. You didn't call. You didn't check in. You just assumed I'd crash and burn, and when I didn't, you still didn't reach out. Not until you needed something from me." My father's jaw tightened. "So this is payback, then? That's what this is?" "No," I said firmly. "This is business. If you were any other tenant, we'd be having the exact same conversation. The only difference is that you expect me to give you special treatment because we share DNA. But I don't owe you that." My mother's voice broke slightly. "We're your parents. You stopped being my parents the night you threw me out." The words hung in the air like something sharp and irreversible. My mother looked down at her hands. My father stared at the wall. Neither of them spoke. I softened my tone, just slightly. Look, I'm not trying to make your lives harder. But I'm also not going to sacrifice my professional integrity or the financial health of this company because of our history. You have options. I've laid them out. You have 30 days to decide what you want to do. My mother nodded, her shoulders sagging. All right. We'll figure something out. They stood to leave, moving slowly like they were carrying something heavy. My father reached the door first and opened it, but my mother lingered, turning back to look at me one more time. You've done really well for yourself, she said softly. I'm proud of you. I didn't respond. I just held her gaze until she looked away and followed my father out into the hallway. The door clicked shut behind them, and the room fell quiet again. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty chairs across from me. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt tired. And strangely hollow, like I'd been holding my breath for years and finally exhaled, only to realize the air still felt thin. I closed the folder, gathered my notes, and walked back to my office. Outside the window, the city moved on, indifferent and constant. Somewhere out there, my parents were driving back to Beaverton, back to the house that no longer felt as secure as it used to. And I was here, in this office I'd built, in this life I'd created, holding all the power I'd once been denied. But power, I was learning, doesn't always feel the way you think it will. Sometimes it just feels like standing alone in a quiet room, wondering if winning was worth what it cost to get here. 3 weeks after the meeting, I received an email from my mother. The subject line was simple. We're staying. The body of the email was even shorter. We've applied for the rental assistance program you mentioned. We'll make the new rent work. Thank you for your time. No apology. No further attempt at reconciliation. Just acceptance. I forwarded it to our accounting department with instructions to process their application and set up a payment plan if they qualified. Then I archived the email and moved on with my day. But something had shifted inside me after that conference room meeting. A restlessness I couldn't quite name. I'd thought confronting them would bring closure, that seeing them diminished and desperate would somehow balance the scales. Instead, it just left me feeling unfinished, like I'd solved the wrong equation. I threw myself into work harder than ever. We acquired 3 new properties that month, expanded into the Vancouver market across the river, hired 2 more staff members. Tommy officially stepped into his advisory role, showing up only once a week for strategic meetings. The firm was thriving, and my name was becoming known in the local real estate community. People started reaching out with investment opportunities, partnership proposals, requests for consultations. One evening in late October, I was working late at the office, reviewing a development proposal, when my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. The message was brief. Hi Natalie, this is Isaac Chen. I'm a journalist working on a piece about housing affordability in Portland. I'd love to talk to you about your work in property management and your perspective on the rental market. Would you be open to a conversation? I almost deleted it. I'd turned down interview requests before, preferring to keep a low profile. But something about the timing felt significant. I'd been thinking a lot about the bigger picture lately, about how personal stories fit into systemic problems. My parents weren't struggling because they were uniquely incompetent. They were struggling because wages hadn't kept up with housing costs, because the safety nets were full of holes, because the system was designed to extract rather than support. I texted back. Sure. When works for you? We met at a coffee shop in the Alberta Arts District 2 days later. Isaac was younger than I expected, probably mid-20s, with wire-rimmed glasses and a notebook already open on the table when I arrived. He stood and shook my hand, thanking me for taking the time. We talked for over an hour. He asked thoughtful questions about the business side of property management, about the balance between profitability and ethics, about what I'd learned working my way up from nothing. I found myself being more honest than I intended, talking about the gaps in the system, the tenants I'd seen fall through the cracks, the impossible choices people faced when their rent went up and their wages didn't. And then he asked a question that caught me off guard. Do you think the system can be fixed from within, or does it need to be torn down and rebuilt? I thought about it for a long moment, watching the steam rise from my coffee. I think it depends on who's doing the building. If the people making decisions have never experienced instability, never had to choose between rent and food, never been one paycheck away from homelessness, then no amount of reform will address the real problems. But if you get people into positions of power who understand what it's like to be powerless, maybe there's a chance. He nodded, scribbling notes. And you're one of those people. I am. But I'm also part of the system now. And that's complicated. The article came out 2 weeks later. It was fair, well-researched, and it quoted me extensively. But what surprised me was the response. I started getting emails from people who'd read it. Some were other property managers who resonated with the challenges I described. Some were tenants sharing their own stories of struggle. And a few were from organizations working on housing advocacy, asking if I'd be interested in collaborating on policy proposals or community programs. One email stood out. It was from a nonprofit called Foundations First, an organization that helped young people aging out of foster care find stable housing and job training. The director, a woman named Rachel Odom, wanted to know if I'd consider partnering with them to create a mentorship program for young adults trying to break into real estate. I read the email 3 times. This was the kind of work that felt meaningful in a way that profit margins and portfolio growth never quite did. I replied that same day, and within a month, we'd launched a pilot program. 6 young people, all between 18 and 22, all facing the same kind of uncertainty I'd faced at their age. I taught them about property management, financial literacy, how to read a lease, how to negotiate, how to build credit. Tommy volunteered to co-teach some of the sessions, sharing decades of knowledge. One of the participants, a 19-year-old named Destiny, reminded me so much of myself it was almost painful. She was quiet, watchful, fiercely determined but scared to hope too hard. She'd been in and out of group homes since she was 12, and she carried that history in the way she held herself, like she was always ready to run. After the 3rd session, she stayed behind while the others filtered out. "Can I ask you something?" she said, her voice uncertain. "Of course. How did you get past the feeling that you don't deserve it? Like, even when good things happen, you keep waiting for someone to take them away?" I set down the markers I'd been organizing and sat on the edge of the table. "I don't know if you ever fully get past it. But you learn to recognize it for what it is. A scar, not a prophecy. You had to survive things that should never have happened to you, and that leaves a mark. But it doesn't define what you're capable of." She nodded slowly, absorbing that. "Did anyone help you? When you were starting out?" "One person," I said. "A teacher who let me stay with her when I had nowhere to go. She didn't fix everything, but she gave me enough space to figure out the next step. And that was enough." Destiny looked down at her hands. "I don't have someone like that." "You do now," I said. "I'm not going anywhere." Her eyes met mine, surprised and cautious, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to believe me. But she smiled, just a little, and something in my chest loosened. The program grew. By the end of the year, we'd expanded to 12 participants, and 3 of them had already secured entry-level positions in property management or real estate offices around the city. Foundations First wanted to make it permanent, and I agreed to chair the initiative. Around the same time, I got a call from the investment group that owned my parents' property, along with dozens of others in the portfolio. They were considering selling the Beaverton assets to focus on commercial development downtown, and they wanted to know if I'd be interested in purchasing the portfolio. The number they quoted was substantial but manageable if I leveraged my existing properties and brought in a partner investor. I told them I'd think about it and hung up, my mind already racing through the possibilities. If I bought the portfolio, I'd own the house my parents lived in. Not just manage it. Own it. I could set their rent. I could evict them if I wanted to, though the thought made me feel sick. Or I could do something else entirely. Something that had been forming in the back of my mind for weeks now. I called Tommy that evening and laid out the opportunity. He listened carefully, asked a few clarifying questions, then said what I'd hoped he'd say. It's a solid investment. But this feels personal for you. Make sure you're buying it for the right reasons. What are the right reasons? I asked. That's something only you can answer. I spent the next 2 days running numbers, consulting with my accountant, talking to potential co-investors. The deal made financial sense. The properties were undervalued, the neighborhood was stable, and the rental market in Beaverton was strong. But Tommy was right. This wasn't just about money. I thought about Destiny and the other young people in the mentorship program. I thought about Dr. Wells, who'd helped me when I had nothing. I thought about all the tenants I'd worked with over the years who were just trying to keep their heads above water in a system designed to drown them. And I thought about my parents, sitting in that conference room, aged and diminished, apologizing not because they understood what they'd done but because they needed something from me. I made my decision on a Friday afternoon. I called the investment group and told them I'd buy the portfolio, but with one condition. I wanted to implement a tenant stability program across all the properties. Rent increases capped at inflation rates. A hardship fund for tenants facing temporary financial crises. Partnerships with local nonprofits to provide resources and support. They hesitated. That would impact profit margins. I countered with projections showing that tenant retention and reduced turnover would offset the costs. They agreed to a trial period. The paperwork took 6 weeks to finalize. In mid-January, on a cold morning with frost covering the windows of my apartment, I signed the documents that made me the owner of 43 residential properties in Beaverton, including the house on Maple Street where I grew up. I didn't tell my parents right away. I wanted to get the tenant stability program in place first, to make sure it wasn't just a symbolic gesture but an actual functioning system. We hired a community liaison, set up the hardship fund, sent letters to all tenants explaining the new policies. My parents received the same letter everyone else did. A notice that ownership had transferred, an introduction to the new policies, and a reassurance that their tenancy was secure. At the bottom, in small print, it listed the owner. Cross Property Holdings, LLC. They didn't call immediately. It took 3 days. When my phone finally rang and I saw my mother's number, I let it go to voicemail. Then I listened. Natalie. Her voice was strange, caught between disbelief and something that might have been fear. We got a letter. It says the new owner is Cross Property Holdings. Is that you? Are you the one who bought the house? I saved the message and called her back an hour later. She picked up on the first ring. Yes, I said simply. I bought the property. Along with the rest of the portfolio. There was a long silence. Then, quietly, why? Because it made financial sense. And because I wanted to do something different with it. Different how? I explained the tenant stability program, the rent cap policy, the hardship fund. I kept my tone businesslike, informative. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. So you're not going to kick us out? No. You're protected under the same policies as every other tenant. Another pause. I don't understand. After everything, why would you do this? I leaned back in my chair, looking out at the river below. Because somebody helped me when I needed it. And because I'm not interested in repeating the cycles that broke us in the first place. She made a sound that might have been a sob or a laugh, I couldn't tell. Your father is going to have a hard time with this. He doesn't have to accept it. He just has to understand that this is how it is now. Thank you, she said softly. I know I don't have the right to ask for anything from you, but thank you. I didn't respond to that. I just told her the office number if she had any questions about the new policies and ended the call. That night, I pulled out my journal and wrote for the first time in months. I'd been so focused on the external work, the building and acquiring and expanding, that I'd neglected the internal accounting. I wrote about the meeting with my parents, about Destiny and the mentorship program, about the decision to buy the properties and what I hoped it would mean. And then I wrote something I hadn't let myself articulate until that moment. Revenge only works if it makes you feel whole. But I don't feel whole. I feel like I'm standing in the ruins of something, holding all the pieces, trying to decide if I want to build a monument or a garden. I chose garden. Not because I forgave them. Not because I forgot. But because I was tired of letting their choices define mine. I was tired of measuring my worth by their failures. I was ready to build something that belonged entirely to me, something that wasn't a reaction but a creation. The mentorship program expanded again. We added financial workshops, partnered with local colleges to offer scholarships, created pipelines into careers that had seemed impossible to kids who'd started with nothing. I watched Destiny graduate from the program and accept a full-time position at a property management firm across town. I watched her sign the lease on her first apartment, her hands shaking as she wrote her name, tears streaming down her face. "This is mine," she whispered. "Nobody can take this away from me." "I know," I told her. "You earned it." And in that moment, I understood what Dr. Wells had given me all those years ago. Not just a place to sleep or a meal or advice. She'd given me the belief that I could earn my own life. That I didn't have to wait for permission or forgiveness or validation. I could just build. That's what I gave Destiny. And that's what I was finally giving myself. The power I'd worked so hard to gain wasn't about control or retribution. It was about choice. The choice to break patterns. The choice to create instead of destroy. The choice to stand in the space where I'd once been powerless and use that memory to make sure someone else didn't have to feel that way. My parents stayed in the house on Maple Street. They paid their rent on time under the new stabilized rate. We didn't speak often, just the occasional logistical email or brief phone call about property maintenance. The distance between us remained, but it felt different now. Less like an open wound and more like a scar that had finally stopped hurting. I wasn't their daughter anymore, not in the way I'd once wanted to be. But I wasn't their victim either. I was just someone who'd survived them and chosen to build something better in the aftermath. And maybe that was enough. 2 years passed like pages turning in a book I was finally writing instead of reading. The mentorship program became a cornerstone of my work, something I looked forward to more than board meetings or acquisition negotiations. We graduated 43 young people in that time, and 38 of them were either employed in the real estate industry or pursuing related education. The numbers mattered, but the faces mattered more. Each one represented a different version of the life I could have lived if Dr. Wells hadn't opened her door that rainy night. The property portfolio grew steadily. I reinvested profits into building quality, upgrading units, maintaining standards that made tenants want to stay. The tenant stability program worked better than even I'd projected. Turnover dropped by 60%. Maintenance requests were handled faster. Word spread, and we started getting applications from people specifically seeking our properties because they'd heard we treated tenants like human beings instead of revenue streams. My parents remained in the house on Maple Street. They paid their rent reliably through the assistance program, and according to the maintenance logs, they'd stopped calling with complaints. The house was old, sure, but we kept it functional. Fixed the leaky faucet my father had mentioned for years. Replaced the water heater that had been on its last legs. Repainted the exterior. Small things that added up to stability. We didn't speak much. Occasionally my mother would send an email thanking me for approving a repair or extending a deadline. My father never reached out directly, but Kyle told me once that he'd stopped complaining about me at family dinners. Apparently that was progress. Kyle and I had developed something like a functional sibling relationship. We texted sometimes, mostly surface-level stuff about basketball games or funny things we saw online. He'd moved out of the house finally, gotten his own apartment closer to the warehouse where he worked. He seemed lighter when we met for coffee once every few months, like distance from our parents had given him room to breathe too. During one of those coffee meetings, in a cafe in Selwood with rain drumming against the windows, he asked me something I hadn't expected. "Do you ever think about forgiving them?" I stirred my coffee slowly, watching the cream swirl into patterns. "I think about it sometimes. But I don't know what forgiveness would even look like. They're sorry they lost access to me, not sorry for what they actually did." He nodded, understanding without agreeing. Mom asks about you more now. She doesn't say it directly, but I can tell she regrets how things went down. Regret isn't the same as understanding, I said. And I'm not interested in making them feel better about their choices. Fair enough. He took a sip of his coffee, then added quietly, for what it's worth, I think you turned out better than any of us. Including me. You're doing fine, Kyle. He shrugged. I'm getting by. You're actually building something. There's a difference. After he left, I sat there for a while longer, watching people hurry past the windows with umbrellas and hoods pulled tight. I thought about what he'd said, about building versus getting by. I thought about how much of my life had been driven by the need to prove them wrong, and whether that was sustainable, whether it was even healthy. That night I went home and pulled out my journal, the same leather notebook I'd carried since I was 17. The pages were filled now, years of plans and reflections and moments of doubt. I flipped to a blank page near the back and wrote a single question. What am I building toward? Not what was I running from. Not what was I proving. What was I building toward? I didn't have an answer right away. But the question sat with me, following me through the next weeks like a quiet companion. It was there when I toured a new property. It was there when I mentored Destiny through a difficult landlord negotiation at her new job. It was there when I reviewed financial reports and saw how much wealth I'd accumulated, numbers that once would have seemed impossible. In March, I got a call from a hospital in Gresham. My father had been admitted with chest pain. It turned out to be a minor heart incident, not a full attack, but serious enough to keep him overnight for observation. The nurse asked if I could come in to discuss his care plan since my mother didn't have reliable transportation and Kyle was working a double shift. I almost said no. Almost told them to call someone else, to figure it out without me. But something in the nurse's tired, patient voice reminded me of Dr. Wells, and I heard myself saying I'd be there in 30 minutes. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and anxiety. I found his room on the 3rd floor, a semi-private space with a curtain dividing 2 beds. My father was in the one by the window, hooked up to monitors that beeped softly. He looked small against the white sheets, older than I'd ever seen him. His eyes were closed when I walked in, and for a moment I just stood there, watching him breathe. Then his eyes opened and found me. He blinked, confused at first, then something like recognition settled in. Natalie. I pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down. The nurse said you needed someone to talk to about your care plan. He nodded slowly. Your mother, she can't drive at night anymore. Her eyes. And Kyle's at work. I know. I'm here now. We sat in silence for a minute, the monitors filling the space between us. Then he spoke again, his voice rougher than usual. You didn't have to come. I know that too. He looked away, toward the window where the city lights were starting to appear against the dusk. I wasn't a good father to you. The words hung there, stark and unexpected. I didn't respond immediately. I just let them exist, let them settle. No, I said finally. You weren't. He nodded, accepting it. I didn't know how to handle a kid who wanted more than I could understand. Made me feel small. So I made you feel smaller. I felt something shift in my chest, not forgiveness exactly, but something adjacent to it. Understanding maybe. Or just exhaustion from carrying anger for so long. Is this the part where you apologize? He managed a weak smile. Would it matter if I did? I don't know. Maybe. Maybe not. He turned his head to look at me directly. I am sorry. For what it's worth. Your mother is too, even if she doesn't know how to say it right. I nodded slowly. Okay. That's it? Just okay? What else do you want me to say? That it fixes everything? That we can go back to being a normal family? We were never a normal family, Dad. And we're not going to become one now just because you had a health scare. He closed his eyes briefly. I know. I just wanted you to hear it from me. That I was wrong. That you proved me wrong about everything. I didn't do it to prove you wrong. I did it because I didn't have a choice. You made sure of that. Fair enough. The nurse came in then, saving us from whatever came next. She went through the care instructions, the medications, the follow-up appointments. I listened and took notes, asked questions, made sure I understood everything. When she left, my father was watching me again. You're good at this, he said quietly. Taking charge. Making things work. I've had a lot of practice. My mother arrived an hour later, brought by a neighbor. She looked frail in a way I hadn't noticed before, her movements careful, her face lined with worry. When she saw me sitting by my father's bed, she stopped in the doorway, her hand going to her mouth. Natalie. You came. The nurse called. Someone needed to be here. She walked slowly to the other side of the bed and took my father's hand. Thank you. For coming. For being here when we needed you. I stood up, gathering my coat. He's going to be fine. They're keeping him overnight just to be safe. He needs to follow up with a cardiologist next week. I wrote down all the information. I handed her the notes I'd taken, and she accepted them with shaking hands. Will you stay? Just for a little while? I looked at my father, then at her, then at the clock on the wall. I stayed for another hour. We didn't talk much. My mother sat holding my father's hand, and I sat in the chair by the window, scrolling through emails on my phone and half listening to the sounds of the hospital around us. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't a reunion. It was just 3 people in a room, connected by history and genetics and nothing much else. When I finally left, my mother walked me to the elevator. In the harsh fluorescent light of the hallway, I could see how much she'd aged, how tired she looked. You've built a good life, she said quietly. Better than anything we could have given you. You didn't give me anything, I said, not unkindly. I built it myself. I know. That's what makes it good. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped inside. She stood in the hallway, small and alone, watching me go. Just before the doors closed, she said something so quietly I almost didn't hear it. I'm proud of you. The doors slid shut, and I was alone in the descending elevator, my reflection staring back at me from the polished metal. I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt tired, and ready to go home. Over the following months, my father recovered. He started walking in the mornings, eating better, taking his medications. My mother sent me occasional updates via email, brief and factual, like she was reporting to a caseworker rather than her daughter. I responded politely, asked appropriate questions, maintained the careful distance we'd established. But something had changed in me after that hospital visit. The sharp edges of my anger had worn down, not from forgiveness but from simple erosion. I was tired of defining myself in opposition to them. Tired of measuring my success against their failures. I wanted to build something that had nothing to do with them at all. That's when I made the decision to step back from the day-to-day management of the property business. I promoted my assistant manager to director of operations, gave her equity in the company, and shifted my focus entirely to the mentorship program and a new project I'd been developing. A nonprofit focused on creating affordable housing pathways for young adults aging out of institutional care. The organization was called Second Foundation. We worked with developers to create mixed-income housing with built-in support systems. Job training, financial literacy, mental health resources, community building. Everything I'd needed when I was 17 and had nowhere to turn. Dr. Wells would have loved it. She'd passed away the previous year, peacefully in her sleep at 73. I'd spoken at her memorial, talked about how she'd saved my life by giving me space to save myself. Her family had asked me to establish a scholarship in her name, and I'd funded it fully, enough to support students in perpetuity. The work consumed me in the best way. I traveled to conferences, consulted with policy makers, built coalitions with other nonprofits. Destiny joined the board of Second Foundation, bringing perspective I could never have as someone who'd only experienced the system from one angle. Together, we created something that felt larger than revenge, larger than proving anyone wrong. We created something that might actually change the trajectory of lives. On a morning in early June, almost exactly 10 years after my parents had kicked me out, I received a handwritten letter in the mail. The return address was the house on Maple Street. I recognized my mother's handwriting on the envelope. I made coffee before opening it, settling into the chair on my balcony overlooking the river. The sun was just coming up, painting the water gold and pink. I unfolded the letter carefully. "Dear Natalie," it began. "I've started this letter a dozen times and thrown away every version. There's no right way to say what I need to say, so I'm just going to be honest. Your father and I have been talking a lot lately, especially since his health scare. We've been thinking about the choices we made, the things we said to you, the night we asked you to leave. We told ourselves we were being practical, that we were protecting you from disappointment, that we couldn't afford to support your dreams. But the truth is, we were scared. Scared of watching you try and fail. Scared of our own inadequacy. Scared that if you succeeded, it would highlight everything we hadn't done with our own lives. So we cut you loose, and we told ourselves it was for your own good. But it wasn't. It was cowardice, and it was cruel, and it cost us our daughter. I know we can't undo that. I know an apology doesn't fix years of absence and silence. But I want you to know that we see you now. We see what you've built, not just the business success but the way you've helped people who remind you of your younger self. We see the person you became despite us, not because of us. I don't expect you to welcome us back into your life. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that we're sorry, truly sorry, and that we understand now what we couldn't see then. You deserved better from us. You deserved parents who believed in you, who supported you, who celebrated your ambition instead of fearing it. I hope you found people who give you that now. Your mother." I read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and set it on the table beside my coffee. I looked out at the river, at the city waking up around me, at the life I'd built brick by brick from nothing. I thought about responding. I thought about what I might say. But in the end, I realized I didn't owe them words. They'd said what they needed to say, and I'd heard it. That was enough. Instead, I pulled out my phone and texted Destiny. "Free for lunch today? Want to talk about the new housing development proposal?" She replied within minutes. "Absolutely. I've got ideas." I smiled and set the phone down. This was what mattered now. Not the past, not the people who doubted me, not even the vindication of proving them wrong. What mattered was the work. The young people finding their footing. The homes being built. The systems being changed, slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. I picked up the letter one more time and walked inside to my desk. I opened a drawer where I kept important documents, things I wanted to preserve but didn't need to display. I placed the letter inside, next to my college acceptance letter, next to the card Dr. Wells had given me the night she took me in, next to the first lease I'd ever signed as a property owner. They were all artifacts of the journey, pieces of a story that had brought me here. But they weren't the story itself. The story was still being written, every day, in the choices I made about how to use the power I'd earned. Later that week, I was walking through Tom McCall Waterfront Park during my lunch break when I saw a young woman sitting alone on a bench, a overstuffed backpack at her feet, staring at her phone with an expression I recognized. Lost. Scared. Trying to figure out what came next. I almost kept walking. I had a meeting in 20 minutes, calls to return, emails to answer. But something made me stop. I sat down on the other end of the bench, not too close, just present. After a minute, she glanced at me, then away. "You okay?" I asked gently. She hesitated, then shook her head. "Not really. I don't have anywhere to go tonight." I pulled a business card from my wallet and handed it to her. "This is my organization. We help young adults find housing and job training. Call this number. Ask for Maria." Tell her Natalie sent you. She took the card, her hands trembling slightly. Really? Really? You're not alone in this. There are people who can help. Her eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, clutching the card like it was a lifeline. Thank you. I stood up, adjusted my bag, and gave her a small smile. You're going to be okay. It won't feel like it for a while, but you will. As I walked away, I felt something settle in my chest, something that had been restless for years. This was the withdrawal I'd actually needed to make. Not money from a bank account. Not revenge against people who'd hurt me. But the withdrawal of my story from the narrative they'd tried to write for me. They'd said I'd fail. I hadn't. They'd said I was selfish for wanting more. I'd proven that wanting more could mean creating more for others too. They'd said I was nothing without them. I'd become everything in spite of them. But more than that, I'd become someone who recognized that girl on the bench because I'd been her. Someone who had the power to extend a hand instead of walking past. Someone who understood that the real measure of success isn't how high you climb, but whether you send the elevator back down. The sun broke through the clouds as I made my way back to the office, warming my face, and I realized something I'd been too busy to notice before. I was happy. Not the frantic, proving myself kind of happy. Not the hollow, revenge-fulfilled kind of happy. Just the quiet, steady happiness that comes from building a life aligned with your values, from using your second chance to create first chances for others. My parents were still in the house on Maple Street. They probably always would be. And that was fine. They were no longer the center of my story. They weren't even a major chapter anymore. They were just a footnote, an origin point I'd moved beyond. The real story, the one that mattered, was happening now. In every young person who walked through Second Foundation's doors. In every lease signed, every job secured, every moment someone who'd been told they were nothing realized they were everything. That evening, I went home and opened my journal one last time. I flipped past all the plans and goals and angry promises I'd made to myself over the years. And on the last blank page, I wrote something simple. I made it. Not in spite of them. Not because of them. Just made it. Then I closed the journal, placed it on the shelf next to Dr. Wells's books that she'd left me in her will, and turned my attention to the future. There was a site visit tomorrow for the new housing development. A board meeting next week. A young woman I'd met in the park who needed follow-up. A life that needed living, not in reaction to the past, but in creation of something entirely new. The withdrawal was complete. Not of money or property or power. The withdrawal of myself from the story they tried to write, the reclamation of my name, my worth, my future from the people who'd tried to convince me I had none. And what I'd deposited in its place was something they could never take away. Purpose. Community. Legacy. I'd become their landlord's boss, sure. I'd raised their rent, restructured their security. But that was just the surface. The real story was what happened underneath. The slow, deliberate construction of a life that honored the girl who'd sat in her car in the rain with nowhere to go, and promised herself that one day, she'd make sure no one else had to feel that alone. I kept that promise. And I'd keep it for the rest of my life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.